Okay, today, August 2nd, 2026, Donald Trump announced on social media that he is canceling the planned American strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure, contingent on both sides rapidly making a deal. He cited progress in talks, including on the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state media gave no indication that Tehran had asked for the strikes to be called off, acknowledged any talks were in progress, or changed its position on the Hormuz in any way. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman called Trump directly and emphasized the need to prioritize dialogue, reduce escalation, and make every possible effort to achieve calm that paves the way for diplomatic solutions. Iran's wartime military commander issued a public statement accusing the United States of moving at an accelerating pace to fan the flames of a full-scale regional war, and said Washington was using Gulf states' capital, resources, and infrastructure as a shield for its own interests. 2 tankers were struck near Oman overnight. Kuwait's air defenses were responding to fresh Iranian drone attacks this morning, and the 60-day MOU window now has 14 days remaining before the August 16th deadline, with the Nuclear Working Group having produced no publicly documented binding outcome on any of the 3 core issues the agreement was supposed to resolve. Every outlet covering this today is framing it as Trump showing restraint and giving diplomacy one final chance. That is the wrong frame. The right frame is this: Iran did not stop the strikes. Iran did not negotiate the strikes away. Iran did not threaten consequences severe enough to make the strikes politically impossible. Saudi Arabia stopped the strikes. And the fact that Saudi Arabia, not Iran, is the party that canceled America's most powerful remaining military option is the single most important strategic revelation of this entire 5-month conflict. What you're watching today is not American restraint. It is the exposure of America's fatal Gulf dependency in plain sight, in real time, by the country that built that dependency over 50 years and is now discovering what it costs when the dependency runs in the wrong direction. I want to give you a framework for understanding this because I think it explains not just today, but the entire underlying architecture of American power in the Middle East and why that architecture has been more fragile than it appeared throughout this entire conflict. I'm calling it the Gulf dependency trap. Here's the core idea. American military power in the Middle East is not self-sustaining. It depends entirely on a network of Gulf state relationships that provide the basing rights, the airspace access, the logistics infrastructure, the diplomatic cover, and the political legitimacy, without which American military operations in the region are either impossible or catastrophically more expensive. Every American strike on Iran during this conflict has been launched from or through facilities in Gulf states. The aircraft that bombed Iranian nuclear sites in February flew through Gulf airspace. The naval vessels enforcing the blockade were based at Gulf ports. The early warning systems tracking Iranian missiles relied on sensors positioned in Gulf territory. Remove Gulf state cooperation, and the entire operational architecture of American military power in the Middle East collapses within days, not weeks, not months, days. This is not a new observation. American strategic planners have known it for decades. What is new, and what today makes visible for the first time in undeniable form, is that Gulf states know it too. And Saudi Arabia has now demonstrated that it is willing to act on that knowledge when American military objectives diverge too sharply from Gulf economic interests. Let me lay out the specific history of how America built this dependency, because understanding how it was constructed is the only way to understand why it has become a trap. The Gulf dependency was not inevitable. It was a deliberate strategic choice made across several decades, beginning with the Carter Doctrine in 1980, which explicitly committed the United States to using military force to defend Gulf oil supplies, and accelerating dramatically after the first Gulf War in 1991, when the United States established a permanent military presence in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE that transformed what had been a deployment capability into a structural dependency. Before 1991, America could fight a war in the Gulf from a distance. After 1991, the forward basing model made Gulf state political cooperation a prerequisite for American power projection rather than a convenience. That shift was justified by its obvious operational benefits. Forward bases dramatically reduced response times, logistics costs, and the political friction of deploying forces from the continental United States. But every structural dependency has a dependency cost, which is the degree to which the dependent party must adjust its behavior to maintain the relationship. America has been paying the Gulf dependency cost in quiet, invisible ways for 3 decades, avoiding certain pressures on Gulf states, calibrating certain diplomatic positions, managing certain conversations in ways that preserved the basing relationships, even when other American interests might have suggested different approaches. Today, that cost became suddenly, spectacularly visible, because the Gulf dependency cost today was the cancellation of the biggest planned strike of the entire war. Now let me explain specifically how Iran has been managing this dependency throughout the conflict, because the Gulf dependency trap is not something that happened to America accidentally. Iran has been deliberately and systematically activating it since the first week of the war. When Iran struck American military facilities in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan in the early weeks of the conflict, it was not primarily trying to degrade American military capability. The damage to American facilities from those strikes was real, but militarily limited. What Iran was doing was creating exactly the situation it needed to activate the Gulf dependency cost, compelling Gulf states to absorb the military and economic consequences of hosting American forces, and then making clear that the scale of those consequences was directly related to the scope of American military ambitions. Every Iranian strike on Gulf territory was a message to Gulf leaders, not to Washington. The message was this: as long as America pursues maximum military pressure against Iran from your territory, you will continue to pay the price in damaged infrastructure, elevated insurance costs, disrupted shipping, spooked investors, and civilian casualties. The moment America stands down, the strikes on your territory stop. That message was delivered consistently at every escalation point for 5 months. And today it produced its most powerful result: a Gulf leader calling the American president directly to request that he call off the war's most consequential planned operation. Think about what that phone call actually represents in terms of the Gulf dependency trap. Mohammed bin Salman is not a figure who makes requests out of sentimentality. He is one of the most calculating strategic actors in the region, running a government that has bet its entire economic future on Vision 2030, a diversification program that depends on foreign investment, stable oil revenues, functioning logistics infrastructure, and a regional security environment that does not destroy the confidence of the international investors and sovereign wealth funds whose participation Vision 2030 requires. Saudi Arabia's economic transformation program cannot survive a full-scale regional war that turns Gulf shipping lanes into active combat zones, destroys desalination plants and oil export facilities, drives multinational companies out of the Gulf entirely, and makes the region synonymous with catastrophic geopolitical risk for a generation. When MBS called Trump today, he was not performing a diplomatic nicety. He was telling the American president that Saudi Arabia's most important national interest, the economic transformation program that defines MBS's entire legacy, cannot coexist with the military campaign America was preparing to execute. That is not an allied government supporting American objectives. That is an allied government using the leverage that America's dependency gives it to constrain American military action in ways that serve Saudi interests, which today happen to align with what Iran needed. Iran understood this alignment before America did. The entire Iranian approach to Gulf state involvement in this conflict has been calibrated to maximize the divergence between American military objectives and Gulf economic interests, specifically to produce exactly the situation that materialized today. Iran did not try to prevent Gulf states from hosting American forces, which would have been impossible. Iran made hosting American forces so economically painful through drone strikes, shipping disruption, insurance premium spikes, investor confidence erosion, and the constant threat of energy infrastructure targeting that Gulf states eventually faced an impossible choice between their security relationship with Washington and their economic survival. Today, Saudi Arabia made that choice visible by picking up the phone, and the choice it made tells you which pressure was more powerful. The security relationship lost. The economic survival calculation won. Iran engineered that outcome across 5 months of calibrated pressure that was never random, never purely reactive, and never aimed primarily at military damage. It was aimed at this phone call. Let me bring in the specific numbers that make the Gulf economic stakes concrete rather than abstract, because I think hard numbers are the most honest way to show you what was actually behind MBS's call. Saudi Arabia's oil revenues in 2025 were approximately $170 billion. The kingdom's budget for 2026 projected crude oil prices at around $80 per barrel to break even. When the Iran war began and Hormuz disruptions drove Brent crude above $100, this sounds like good news for Saudi Arabia until you understand that Saudi Arabia's massive oil infrastructure, its pipelines, its processing facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais, its export terminals at Ras Tanura, all sit within range of Iranian missiles and drones. A single major Iranian strike on Abqaiq, which processes the majority of Saudi Arabia's oil production, could reduce Saudi export capacity by more than half overnight, the same way it did in 2019 when a drone strike temporarily cut Saudi production by 5% of global supply. The Vision 2030 projects, NEOM, the Red Sea Tourism Mega Project, the sports and entertainment investments, the Sovereign Wealth Fund's international portfolio, all of these are financed by oil revenues that disappear if Iran decides to demonstrate what full economic warfare against the Gulf actually looks like. MBS has been watching American energy infrastructure strike plans develop this week, knowing that the moment America crossed that threshold, Iran's stated response was an extensive plan of retaliation that its military command described as already prepared. And the retaliation Iran prepared almost certainly included options against Saudi infrastructure that MBS could not risk, allowing America to trigger on his territory's behalf. Now, let me bring in the European and Asian dimension of the Gulf dependency trap, because the dependency is not just American. It is global, and the global nature of it is why today's phone call was not simply a Saudi decision. It was a decision shaped by every major economy that imports energy through or from the Gulf, all of whom have been applying quiet but consistent pressure on Washington to avoid the kind of escalation that would turn the current disruption into a permanent catastrophe. Europe's exposure to Gulf energy is well documented, but the less discussed exposure is Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India, economies that collectively import hundreds of billions of dollars of Gulf energy annually, and whose industrial competitiveness depends on predictable access to that supply. When Trump was planning energy infrastructure strikes, the finance ministries of Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei, and New Delhi were doing the same calculation MBS did. And the diplomatic channels from those capitals to Washington were carrying the same message through slightly more discrete pathways. The Gulf dependency trap is not really a Gulf trap. It is a global energy dependency trap that America walked into when it made itself the guarantor of Gulf stability, and then discovered that the global economy's dependency on Gulf stability also constrains America's freedom of military action in ways Washington never fully reckoned with. I want to give you the strongest version of the counterargument, because I think intellectual honesty demands taking it seriously before I explain what it cannot resolve. The case for viewing today's strike cancellation as a sophisticated American move rather than a dependency trap goes as follows. Trump canceled the strikes, subject to rapidly making a deal, which means the threat is preserved. The military option did not disappear. It was conditionally suspended, which gives Iran a specific and urgent incentive to reach a final agreement in the 14 days remaining before the MOU expires. From this perspective, the planned strikes were always partly a coercive signal rather than a committed operational order. The fact that MBS called suggests the signal was credible enough to mobilize diplomatic activity that might actually produce an outcome. And the outcome of that diplomatic activity, if it produces a genuine final agreement in the next 14 days, would vindicate the entire approach. Sometimes, in international relations, the threat that produces results is more powerful than the action that replaces it, and the canceled strike that generates a final deal is a better strategic outcome than the executed strike that provokes an Iranian declaration that the MOU is void and restarts full-scale war. That argument is not without merit. Coercive diplomacy does sometimes work exactly this way, and there are historical examples of credible military threats producing diplomatic breakthroughs that the actual execution of force would have prevented. But here is what that argument cannot explain about today specifically. Iran's state media gave no indication that Tehran asked for the strikes to be called off, acknowledged any talks were in progress, or changed its position on Hormuz in any way. If the coercive threat had actually produced the desired Iranian behavior change, you would expect some visible signal from Tehran that the pressure was working, some softening of language, some acknowledgement that the situation had changed. Instead, Iran's military commander issued a statement accusing America of fanning flames of war, and Iran's foreign ministry warned of a decisive response to any aggression. These are not the communications of a government that has just been successfully coerced into a more cooperative posture. They are the communications of a government that watched its adversary mobilize, watched its adversary's ally call to cancel the strike, and is now describing that outcome as further evidence of American overextension rather than as a warning that caused a behavioral change. The coercive signal reached Saudi Arabia. It did not reach Tehran. That is the Gulf dependency trap in its most precise form. America's military threats are now primarily affecting its own allies rather than its adversary. There's also a 14-day clock dimension to today's events that makes the Gulf dependency trap more urgent than anything that has happened in the previous 45 days of the MOU period. The agreement expires on August 16th. The Nuclear Working Group has produced no publicly documented binding commitment. The inspections dispute that erupted on June 23rd has not been resolved. Iran's position that inspections only follow a final deal with all sanctions lifted remains unchanged. The missiles are still explicitly off the table. Hormuz is still under Iran's declared exclusive management. And the one tool that Washington had not yet deployed, energy infrastructure strikes, has just been conditionally suspended in exchange for a deal that must be reached rapidly, meaning the specific urgency pressure that might have forced a genuine Iranian concession has been exchanged for a diplomatic promise that Iran has not publicly acknowledged making. If the next 14 days do not produce a final agreement, America will face the same choice it faced this weekend. Either execute the energy strikes in the last days of the MOU window under conditions where Iran can credibly declare the agreement void and resume full Hormuz closure, or let the window expire without having extracted the concessions the agreement was supposed to deliver. The Gulf dependency trap does not resolve itself because a deadline arrives. It resolves only when the underlying dependency is acknowledged and managed, and nothing in today's news suggests that acknowledgement is happening inside the rooms where American decisions are being made. Here are the 4 things I want you to watch over the next 14 days specifically, because each one will tell you whether the Gulf dependency trap closes completely or whether Washington finds a way to alter the dynamics before August 16th. First, watch whether Iran acknowledges any deal progress publicly in the next 72 hours, because a government that was genuinely moving toward a final agreement in response to the strike threat would need to manage its domestic audience about the concessions it is making, and that management requires some level of public acknowledgement that the situation has changed. If Iranian state media continues to report nothing about progress while American officials continue describing progress, the separate deal problem from June 23rd is still running, and the 14-day window will expire in the same condition it began. Second, watch whether MBS issues any public statement about what he asked Trump to do and what he received in return, because a Saudi leader who called the American president to cancel a strike has implicitly claimed a form of influence over American military decision-making that Saudi Arabia will want to either formalize or quietly bank for future use. How Riyadh describes this moment publicly will tell you whether it views the Gulf dependency trap as a one-time intervention or as a precedent it intends to exercise again. Third, watch whether CENTCOM stands down any of its readiness posture in the Gulf, or whether the forces prepared for the energy infrastructure campaign remain at the same readiness level despite the cancellation, because forces maintained at strike readiness with a conditional suspension are a different signal than forces visibly stood down. The military posture will tell you whether the cancellation is a pause or a pivot. And fourth, watch what Iran does in the Strait over the next 72 hours, because if Iran reads today's cancellation as confirmation that the Gulf dependency trap is fully operational and that American strikes can be prevented by sufficient Gulf state pressure, the rational Iranian response is to test that reading by resuming maritime operations at a level that would previously have triggered the energy strike option. If Iranian behavior in the Strait escalates rather than de-escalates following today's cancellation, you will know that Iran's read of the situation is identical to the framework I have described, and that Tehran is deliberately pressing the advantage the Gulf dependency trap has handed it. Here is what I keep coming back to. America spent 50 years building the most powerful forward military presence in history in the Gulf, and in doing so created a structural dependency so deep that today, when it was finally prepared to use that presence to execute the most consequential strike of an entire war, the government of the country, hosting the most critical piece of that infrastructure, called the American president and asked him not to. Trump canceled the strike. Iran said nothing. Saudi Arabia said everything. The Gulf dependency trap is not a weakness America can fix by building more bases or deploying more carriers. It is an architectural feature of the forward basing model itself, the inevitable consequence of making your most powerful military options dependent on the continued cooperation of states whose interests will not always align with yours, especially when the military options you want to execute are the ones that threaten the economic foundations those states are built on. Iran did not create this trap. America built it over 5 decades, and Iran spent the last 5 months learning how to close it. Today, it closed, and with 14 days left on a clock that has not produced a single verified concession on the issues that actually matter, the question is not whether America understands what happened today. The question is whether understanding it changes anything about what is possible in the time that remains. Tell me whether you think the 14-day window produces a genuine final agreement, or whether August 16th arrives with the Gulf dependency trap still fully closed, and both sides deciding what comes next without the framework the MOU was supposed to provide. Subscribe if you want the next update the moment either Iran publicly acknowledges any deal progress or the energy strike option is formally taken off the table.